say to everybody, there are other ways of having simple majority votes, and if there's an objection to this, we have to go to that.
Mr. President.
The senator from Alabama.
I would just note that Senator Grassley just offered to, in a few minutes, to commence voting on 2 amendments in the normal way we would proceed here, and I think that was a very reasonable request. We've got to be careful. These amendments represent important changes to a historic piece of legislation, and we can't just throw up a bunch of amendments here at the beginning and people haven't had time to digest them. So I think as we proceed, we're going to need to be sure that it's just not some situation where people bring up an amendment an hour or so later it has to be voted on and people haven't had a time to fully digest it. I think the offer by Senator Grassley is very reasonable.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, while the senator from New York is still here, I just want to respond briefly and in a non-confrontational way, but I would hope that on something as important as this, we're all operating from the same facts and not based on erroneous information or erroneous assumptions. First of all, my understanding is the Congressional Budget Office hasn't scored the underlying bill. As I said earlier, on page 872 of this bill, a comprehensive immigration reform trust fund is created, and $8.3 billion are transferred into that trust fund. My amendment uses the same money that the underlying bill does to fund the requirements of my amendment. And this notion that somehow having a biometric entry-exit system cost $25 billion is completely detached from any factual information I'm aware of. My staff informs me, based on our best estimate, that a biometric entry-exit system at the airports and at seaports would cost roughly $80 million a year. And we're more than happy to share that information with our colleagues and have them take a look at it. Further, I would say...
Gentleman, yield for a question.
Just give me a second, Senator McCain. Further, I know there's been an assumption that somehow that there's been a figure of 10,000 new Border Patrol agents mandated in my amendment. That is incorrect reading of it. The underlying bill calls for 3,500, and we plus that up, we do, by not only Border Patrol but also Customs and Border agents to help facilitate the flow of illegal commerce across Arizona and Texas borders and elsewhere, which creates about 6 million jobs in America. So I don't mind us having a disagreement about policy. We're used to that. That's fine. But I think some of these claims about extravagant expenses are just not borne out by the facts, and we would actually rely upon the same money that the trust fund created by the underlying bill does. And I would yield to my friend from Arizona.
Well, I would just ask my friend from Texas, if you're adding additional either Border Patrol or Customs in addition to what's already in the underlying bill, where does your money come from? We are talking about personnel costs, which are incredibly expensive. And so I would ask him where the money comes from. If there's not additional costs, he'd have to take it from someplace else.
It comes, Mr. President, if I can respond to my friend from Arizona, it comes from the same trust fund that the underlying bill uses. It reallocates the money and does put some more money toward personnel. One of the problems is that, I mean, there's so much that technology can do, and I'm excited about the prospects of technology when it comes to 100% situational awareness and allowing the Border Patrol to do a good job. But you got to have Border Patrol that show up and detain people when they come across illegally. And my state has the longest border with Mexico, 1,200 miles. Arizona's got its own challenges. We have our challenges as well. So we do need more personnel. But the part that I would think that is sort of baked into the underlying bill is that we also need to separate the legal commerce and tourism that's beneficial to both sides of the border. And that's part of why the customs agents that are included in my amendment are also there as well, because the theory being, and I think it's a good one, if you identify legitimate commerce and beneficial tourism and separate that from the bad guys, then law enforcement can focus more on the bad guys. That's what my amendment attempts to do, and it's no additional money.
The gentleman would again yield to a question.
Sure.
You are adding personnel into your version of the bill. The money has to come from somewhere. Where is it coming from? You're saying it's, quote, reallocated. Where is it reallocated from?
It comes from the same trust fund that's created on page
There's a finite amount of money.
872
There's
of the
a finite amount of money that is authorized. If the senator takes money from one and adds money one place, it has to come from someplace else. That's simple first-grade mathematics, and I think it's incredible that the senator should stand there and say, yeah, we're adding these thousands of personnel, but yet there's no additional cost. That's not possible.
Mr. President, if I can explain to the senator from Arizona, this is the trust fund created by the underlying bill on page 872.
There's a finite amount of money in it.
It is $8.3 billion. They allocate some of that money for the purposes set out in the underlying bill. My amendment reallocates some of that same trust fund for other purposes, including additional personnel. There's no additional money.
Question.
This is an appropriation made in the underlying bill. So I think it's a misunderstanding of what
Would my colleague yield for a question?
Sure would.
How many extra personnel does he ask for in his bill? Do you ask for in your bill? In your amendment?
It is the underlying bill, Mr. President, calls for 3,500.
How many more do you ask for?
And so we ask for a plus-up of another 6,500.
Okay, Mr. President, it is quite arguable that the entire trust fund is used up by those 6,500. That would mean no drones. That would mean no helicopters. That would mean none of the other things. It may mean no fencing that we add to the border. So my colleague from Arizona is exactly correct. The costs here, now my good friend from his side of the aisle, Senator Graham, estimated this morning that the total cost would be $18 billion. I think if you add the type of land-based exit entry, it goes up another $7–8 billion. We don't have that kind of money. So I would suggest to my colleague that if he wants to add 10,000 Border Patrol, which most experts have told us will not do close to as good a job as the drones and the helicopters and the more mobile axes. And the reason is very simple. He knows as well as I do. He knows the border better than I do. We don't have roads on most of the border. What are the Border Patrol going to do? There are no roads. They're impassable. A drone flying, 10,000 feet above can see every person who crosses the border, track them inland, and if they go to a gathering point 25 miles inland, they pick them up there. And so the bottom line is, not only is the cost of this bill probably exceeding the trust fund on itself, but it will take a highly efficient way of preventing people from crossing the border and replace it with an inefficient way that no expert I have talked to, and again, maybe my colleague has, no expert I have talked to say the best way to control people from crossing the border illegally, which I desperately want to do, works better with a huge amount of personnel unallocated. We don't even know. If I ask my colleague, where are they going to be assigned? Which sectors? Where are they going to work? I bet there's no answer to that. The bottom line is very simple. We have carefully thought this through. We think we have maximized the effectiveness for about a third of the money that our colleague is talking about. It's only one of many reasons that this amendment was defeated by a bipartisan group, majority in committee. So let's move on. Let's move on. Let's look at how we can make the border more secure. I am open to that.
Mr. President.
But this amendment, as I said, for a variety of reasons, is a non-starter.
The senator from Texas has the floor.
Mr. President, what is this, the third day this bill's been on the floor? There's been no scoring of the bill by the Congressional Budget Office, so no one knows what the official scorekeeper of the United States Congress has to say about this bill. But I would say that my amendment does not appropriate any additional money other than the money in the bill. And indeed, this leaves it up to the Department of Homeland Security within 120 days to render a plan. And then under the underlying bill, you can transition after 10 years from RPI status, registered provisional immigrant, to legal permanent resident by substantial completion of a plan that we don't know anything about. I mean, I don't think we are the experts in how exactly this should be done, and I would hope that technology, which I think is fantastic, what answers that may provide to us 10 years hence in terms of how to accomplish the goals. But to suggest that somehow this legislation, which I've complimented on numerous occasions, that it represents a substantial step in the right direction, to say that we can't touch it, we can't change it because 8 senators got together and decided what it should read, is preposterous. That's exactly what we're supposed to do here, and we ought to have a regular process to debate it and vote on it, but we shouldn't be sort of suggesting that, you know, been there, done that, because you had your shot in committee, and not allow this process to move forward here.
Mr. President.
I don't think we are all that far apart if we'll stick to the facts and we'll stick to the text of the bill, but we shouldn't make things up. And particularly on the order of $25 billion, I don't know where that came from. I know there was a suggestion that my amendment called for 10,000 new Border Patrol agents, and that's not in the bill. So let's stick to the facts, Mr. President.
Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I would just say this. Number one, this amendment, we are only on the 3rd day of the bill. And I have said over and over again, I welcome suggestions how to improve the bill. No one says that the Gang of Eight's bill is exactly right. In fact, as Senator Leahy well knows, our chairman of Judiciary, we accepted a large number of amendments, many of which came from the other side in committee, and we'll do the same thing here. But this particular amendment is not 3 days old. I'd be happy to yield.
Isn't it true that whether it's been scored by CBO or not, the legislation calls for the expenditure of certain amounts of money? In other words, about $6.2 billion, I believe. So, if it calls for the expenditure of a certain amount of money and it designates what that money is for, if you're going to add thousands of Border Patrols onto it, then it seems logical that that's going to cost more money, right? Okay.
I would say it's hard to refute my friend from Arizona's logic.
The second point, could I just finish my question? I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
That's okay.
And isn't it true that we have said, look, we welcome any suggestion as to improve the bill? So I would say respectfully to my friend from Texas, it's not true that this is written in golden tablets. In fact, the senator from Ohio who's coming here is going to have some suggestions for improvements on the exit entry visa, which I think will make the bill much better. So somehow allege that we think, isn't it true that somehow allege that we've said that there could be no changes is patently false. Third of all, I guess, isn't it true that this amendment would break the agreement that was a hard-fought agreement, and we are willing to compromise and make agreements in certain areas, but not to a bill that billions and billions of dollars are added to, and especially in the area of personnel, when we've gone from 4,000 members of the Border Patrol several years ago to 21,000. Right. And we are adding National Guard to the border. And personnel is not the challenge, whether it be the Texas border or the Arizona border. What is the challenge is to use the technology that is existing so that we can surveil and intercept.
Would my
That's
colleague,
what this bill is all about.
I thank my colleague for those questions, and they're all pretty obvious. Number one, we have costed this out. CBO will judge whether we're correct. And we've made the bill revenue neutral. In fact, we have a slight surplus. The huge cost of 6,500 border agents without any allocation of where they would go, you know what, if this were another bill, my colleague from Texas and all of his colleagues would say, wasting billions of dollars with no plan. So he's exactly right on that point. On the second point, I have said till I'm blue in the face, sometimes from some criticism from some of the people who are my allies out there, that I'm willing to look at changes in this bill. It is so unfair and patently false to say any one of the group of 8 said that we can't change the bill. We welcome changes to improve it, and what happened in committee proves that. And third, I'd say to my colleague another point. The way the gentleman from Texas constructs the trigger, there will be no one who will ever achieve a path to citizenship because he leaves out turnbacks. And if you don't have turnbacks, the 90% causes us trouble even with the way it was done in other areas, with other suggestions. But if you leave out turnbacks, people who are turned back, who are caught and said, go home, you will never get to 90%. So to say that the senators from Texas's proposal allows a path to citizenship, it makes it virtually impossible. And therefore, again, I would say, I want to improve border security. I am open to suggestions. I want to improve this bill in every area. I know my colleague from Arizona, my colleague from Colorado, my colleague from Illinois, and the rest of us welcome that, and we've shown it time and time again. But this amendment, I don't think, advances moving the bill forward. It doesn't work on border security because of its expense and its lack of specificity, and it's taking away the very technology we need. It doesn't create a path to citizenship in any way. It doesn't allow one. And finally, its cost is through the roof. Whatever CBO says, 6,500 new border agents is a multi-billion-dollar proposition unpaid for, which I know my colleagues on the other side are rue the day when we vote for unpaid-for obligations. I would yield to my colleague from Vermont.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, there's been some discussion about whether this might be a closed thing, and the 8 senators who came together on this, I think, and did a tremendous job. 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and put it together, that they were saying it was closed. But isn't it true that there were, when your bill came to the committee, the Judiciary Committee, isn't it true there were 301 amendments filed in the committee?
That is exactly the right number as I recall it.
And isn't it true that 136 of those amendments were then adopted?
My count is exactly the same.
And 49 of those amendments were proposed by Republicans. Is that not correct?
And we are so proud of that fact, Mr. Chairman. You are correct.
And isn't it possible to say that of the 8 senators we've talked about, 4 of them, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, serve on the Judiciary Committee, and they were helpful in voting for most of these amendments that were changes to the original. Is that not correct?
I agree. That is the right count. There were 4 of us there, and we did just as the chairman has stated.
I just thought I'd mention.
Could the chairman...
To yield for a question.
Could the gentleman...
Just to finish with my question to the senator from New York, I just want to make sure, because I thought I heard some commenting that this was a closed process, and I appreciate the senator from New York agreeing that it was anything but.
I yield to the senator from Arizona.
Senator from Arizona is recognized.
The senator from Ohio is working on E-Verify, not accident, on E-Verify. And I think that he's come up with some very good ideas on how we can really improve a vital part of this bill, and that is the verification of someone who applies for a job, because that's the magnet that draws people across the border. And again, we look forward to those kinds of improvements and many other suggestions that have been made. And again, how you can manufacture 3,500 new personnel and say it doesn't add to the cost and it'll be reallocated. I want to know where it's reallocated from.
I thank my colleague, and I agree with his sentiments. I just reiterate one final point here. The Cornyn amendment as proposed asks for a 90% success rate in terms of effectiveness on the border, but it eliminates the turnback part of it. That would mean now that it would be virtually impossible to get to that 90% 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Because one of the most effective things we do on the border is turn people back. You don't catch them after they cross the border. They get up to the border and we find them and say, go home. And so it just fails on both counts. It's been debated. It's been studied. I would plead with my colleagues who want more border security. Let's move on. The senator from Utah has amendments on taxes and on benefits. The senator from Ohio has amendments on E-Verify. Many of my colleagues have amendments on many other issues, and we are open to debate and discussion as long as the core principles that the 8 of us agreed, that's an agreement among the 8 of us, and the rest of you can disagree with that. We think most of you will agree with those core principles, but so be it. But aside from the basic core of the bill, we welcome changes and suggestions and improvements, and we look forward to a healthy debate. But to bring up an amendment that has been rejected and basically turns things on its head because there will be no path to citizenship for anybody, and because you're just sort of, if you will, in all due respect,
More question.
throwing money at a problem without a specificity as to where the money goes, that doesn't move the debate forward.
The gentleman yield for one more
I
question.
yield to my colleague.
The senator from Arizona is recognized.
I hope that the senator from New York understands what the chief of the Border Patrol said on this issue of 90% effectiveness. And we're going to hear this over and over again. I quote, in a hearing on February 26, 2013 of the House Homeland Security Committee, the Chief Fisher, chief of the Border Patrol, not the Secretary of Homeland Security, said, quote, first of all, 90% really wouldn't make sense everywhere. We put 90% as a goal because there are sections along the border where we've not only achieved, we've been able to sustain 90% of effectiveness. So it's a realistic goal, but I wouldn't necessarily and just arbitrarily say 90% is across the board, because there are other locations when there's less activity. There won't be a lot of activity simply because of terrain features, for instance. So where it makes sense, we want to go ahead and start parsing that out within those corridors and within those specific sectors. That's why we think that what we came up with in this legislation is effective control, 100% surveillance, and the use of technology, which I am confident will give us a border that all Americans can be happy with. No border is ever going to be sealed. And anybody who stands in this body and says, if you want to hire 10,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 more Border Patrol agents, you still aren't going to secure the border completely. But we can have effective control of that border, and we can have 100% surveillance, and we can get the border to the point where American people can have confidence in it while we move forward with the path to while we move forward with the rest of the legislation. I thank my colleague.
I thank my colleague in reclaiming the floor for just a brief minute, and I know my colleague from Utah has been offered time to speak on his proposals, so I don't want to take too much more time. I would just say once again that we welcome suggestions, that the senator from Arizona is right. We carefully looked at the border. This wasn't fly-by-night. And every one of us, certainly myself, wants to see that border as secure as possible. It so happens that 6,500 more Border Patrol agents, if you ask the experts, they wouldn't know what to do with them, because large sections of the border have no roads, have no way to station Border Patrol agents there, whereas helicopters, drones, and mobile forces work. And it was my colleague from Arizona who actually taught me that on a trip to the border. He used his military expertise to help us figure out the most effective way to seal the border most effectively. And when I hear my colleague from Texas's amendment, I don't get what the logic is behind it. And I certainly don't get the logic on his trigger. You know, it's fair if you want to make sure the border is secure. But if you use triggers, as some might, I'm not saying my colleague from Texas's intent is that, but if triggers become a way to avoid a path to citizenship without saying directly, I want to avoid a path to citizenship because I don't want to vote for it, That is not going to work, and we will not move forward. And this nation desperately needs us to move forward as Democrats and Republicans together. Let's continue the bipartisan spirit that we've had. Let us move forward together to make this bill better and make our country proud of us and keep America the leading power economically and every other way in the United States. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senior senator from Utah is recognized.
could I ask Mr. Lashnam's consent to ask the distinguished senator from Ohio, without losing my right to the floor, if he has something he wanted to do. I didn't mean to jump in front, but I was told I could appear here at 4.
To my colleague from Utah.
Senator from Ohio.
The ranking member of the Finance Committee, member of the Judiciary Committee, I was told I could speak even before that, but then the Majority Leader came out on the floor to do some important business, so I was pushed back. So I have about 5 or 10 minutes I'd like to talk about E-Verify, as was indicated earlier, and border security, but I would defer to my colleague as long as my other colleagues would allow me to speak after him.
Well, I appreciate my friend from Ohio. I'd be happy to defer to you, too. I mean, if that's the way it is. But I appreciate it. I'd ask unanimous consent that the distinguished senator from Ohio can speak on, give his remarks immediately following mine.
Is there objection? So ordered. Senator from Utah.
And Mr. President, I want to take some time today to talk about the immigration bill before us, its flaws, and what needs to be done to fix them. Now, I first want to note that I voted in favor of reporting this legislation out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I worked in good faith with my colleagues to secure the inclusion of provisions in addressing things like high-skilled immigration and a new agricultural visa program. Indeed, throughout the Judiciary Committee process, I was a willing negotiator on many important issues surrounding this bill. In general, I am in favor of immigration reform, and I want to see this bill succeed. I also want to commend my colleagues for their work on this legislation so far. Up to now, I think the process has been fair. It's been transparent, and I believe bipartisan. I hope that will continue now that the bill is on the floor. It's important that we continue to work on a bipartisan basis because the bill is far from perfect. You can't look at it without knowing that. In my view, there are a number of issues that need to be addressed before this legislation is ready for final passage. During the Judiciary Committee's consideration of S-744, I introduced 4 amendments on issues that fall under the jurisdiction of the Senate Finance Committee. At the time, I stated that my continued support for the bill was contingent on whether those issues were addressed before final passage. Today, I will file similar amendments here on the floor with the hope that I can work with my colleagues to address these concerns. I want to say up front that despite what will likely be several claims to the contrary, these are not poison pill amendments. I have no desire to weaken the bill or to threaten its prospects for final passage. Indeed, I think my 4 amendments will make it easier to pass the bill with strong bipartisan support, not only here, but in the House. Senator Rubio, a member of the Gang of 8, is a co-sponsor on these amendments. I appreciate his willingness to work with me on these important issues. He's been the one singular person, in my opinion, who has had an open mind and willing to work on these issues with both sides. He deserves a lot of credit for this bill, but he knows it's not perfect. He knows it's not there yet. I know he wants to do the right thing. I can only hope that other proponents of this legislation will be willing to do the same. Each of my amendments is designed to ensure that illegal immigrants applying for a change in status are not awarded special privileges and benefits under the law. I don't want to punish these immigrants. I simply want to make sure that they are treated no better or worse than U.S. citizens and resident aliens with respect to federal benefits and taxes. Let me take a few minutes to describe each of my amendments. My first amendment is designed to ensure compliance with federal welfare and public benefits law. As we all know, last July, during the height of the presidential campaign, the Department of Health and Human Services issued an information memo to states allowing them to waive federal welfare work requirements. We now know that HHS attorneys have concluded that the then HHS Secretary has the authority to waive almost any prohibitions on federal welfare spending that exist under current law. Certainly a false interpretation.
Under a longstanding provision of federal welfare law, non-citizens are banned from receiving cash welfare assistance for their first 5 years in this country. Under S-744, that 5-year ban is extended to registered provisional immigrants, or RPIs, and blue card holders. However, under the HHS's current interpretation of the law, the Department could choose at any time to ignore this restriction and enter welfare benefits to these groups of non-citizens. My amendment would simply clarify the law to make clear that the Obama administration does not have the authority to allow states to waive these long-standing restrictions and ensure that welfare benefits are not offered to non-citizens as a result of this bill. As I stated, this is not punitive. This is not designed to punish any illegal immigrants seeking a change in status. It is instead designed to preserve the balance that exists under current welfare law. Some critics of the underlying bill have claimed that it will allow illegal immigrants to receive welfare benefits. And when you couple the bill with HHS's recently claimed waiver authority, these critics actually have a point. My amendment would protect the bill from this type of criticism. That's a step in the right direction. I think it'll bring people onto the bill. Let me make one thing clear. No one who is currently eligible to receive welfare benefits will be denied them as a result of this amendment. Instead, this amendment does something we should have done long ago, which is to assert the prerogatives of the Congress in the face of executive overreach. There's no question that, with its information memo permitting states to waive federal welfare work requirements, the Obama administration overstepped its statutory authority. And we now know that officials in the administration were working through ways to circumvent key features of welfare reform for years, including how and on whom federal welfare dollars can be spent. So we know they believe they can allow states to spend federal welfare dollars on non-citizens, so I don't think it's far-fetched to conclude at some point they will allow states to spend federal welfare dollars on non-citizens. Congress needs to act to prevent this and future administrations from engaging in this type of overreach. That's the purpose of this amendment, my amendment. My second amendment would apply a 5-year waiting period before immigrants become eligible for tax credits and cost-sharing subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, or the so-called Affordable Care Act. Under current federal law, most lawful permanent residents or green card holders must wait 5 years before they're eligible for most means-tested benefits, including Medicaid and TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. However, the bill does not apply this same 5-year waiting period to the premium credits and subsidies offered under the Affordable Care Act. True enough, the bill does not allow RPIs and blue card holders to access these benefits, but once they become lawful permanent residents, they can access them immediately. This is a serious oversight that essentially creates a carve-out for the Affordable Care Act. My amendment would, and a huge expense to this government. My amendment would correct this oversight and put the Affordable Care Act subsidies in the same class as other federal benefits. This is only fair. After all, even those who were U.S. citizens at the time the health law was passed have had to wait nearly 5 years for the law to go into effect so they could access these credits and subsidies. Those who would, under this bill, be placed on a path to citizenship should be required to do the same. The amendment also prevents non-immigrants who are not on any path to citizenship from accessing these benefits. My gosh, anybody on this floor should want that. Under the bill, a ban on Affordable Care Act benefits is applied to only RPIs and blue card holders, but not to non-immigrants. My amendment would extend the ban to non-immigrants. Let me repeat that. Under the bill, a ban on Affordable Care Act benefits is applied to only RPIs and blue card holders, but not to non-immigrants. My amendment would extend the ban to non-immigrants. Once again, my goal with this amendment is not to punish any immigrant applicants or deny them benefits that they might be entitled to under the law. I simply want to ensure that we're not creating a new class of people with special access to federal benefits. We can prevent that by imposing the same waiting periods on Affordable Care Act subsidies that we place on other federally means-tested benefits. My third amendment would help to preserve the Social Security system. Under current law, for a worker to be eligible for Social Security benefits, they must be classified as, quote, fully insured, unquote, or, quote, permanently insured, unquote. To become insured, a worker accrues quarters of coverage during the years they work in the United States. S-744 is unclear as to whether it would allow an illegal immigrant who obtains a change in status to claim years of unauthorized employment to determine their eligibility for Social Security benefits. Indeed, this bill is entirely silent on this matter. Once again, this is a glaring oversight in the legislation that needs to be rectified in order to preserve the integrity of the Social Security system. My amendment makes it clear that no periods of unauthorized employment can be counted in an employee's quarters of coverage, and thus they cannot be used to determine eligibility for Social Security. This is not a matter that can be simply overlooked. If someone was not authorized to work in this country but made the calculated decision to work anyway using a made-up or stolen Social Security number, or if someone overstayed their visa and worked anyway, they should not have been working and paying into the Social Security system. Consequently, they are ineligible for benefits until they become citizens. Once again, there's nothing punitive involved with this amendment. It only ensures that we do not reward past unlawful activities. Once they're lawful, under this bill, they can participate, but not for the past unlawful activities. That's like rewarding people for doing wrong and disobeying our laws and ignoring the obligations that come with living in the United States of America. And it's a punch in the face to every law-abiding citizen that's been making these payments. The amendment provides the fairest and most workable path forward. Now, my fourth and final amendment is the one that's garnered the most attention, as it should in some ways. I think all three of these amendments have been very important and will be very important in this debate. And I'm certainly hoping my colleagues on the other side will recognize that and help to pass them. This Fourth Amendment would modify provisions in the bill relating to back taxes to include all income and employment taxes owed by immigrant applicants. For the past few months, proponents of this legislation, including members of the so-called Gang of Eight, have been claiming that as a condition of being put on a path to citizenship, illegal immigrants will be required to pay back taxes. This claim was repeated in the halls of Congress, on Sunday morning talk shows, and in casual conversation. This was a promise made as a chief response to arguments that the bill would provide amnesty for illegal immigrants. However, under the current draft of the legislation, this promise goes largely unfulfilled. The bill currently states that illegal immigrants cannot apply for a change in status unless they have, quote, satisfied any applicable federal tax liability, unquote. Well, that is all well and good. Under this standard, immigrant applicants will not be required to pay any portion of their back taxes owed to any part of their U.S. residency unless the IRS has already made a tax assessment. This will only occur in the very rare case where the IRS has already audited an immigrant applicant and found a tax deficiency. So put simply, very few people will be required to pay back taxes under this provision. My amendment would require RPI applicants to demonstrate that they either have no obligation to pay back taxes or to actually pay the back taxes that they lawfully owe. It also requires them to remain current on their tax obligations once they obtain the change in status. Once again, Mr. President, this is only fair. Some may claim that it's punitive, but that's absurd. Is it punitive to ask immigrant applicants to live up to the same standards and requirements imposed on citizens and legal residents? No. When a citizen decides to leave the U.S. and renounce their citizenship, they often face taxes on income earned in the U.S. and on any gains from accredited assets. Is it punitive to apply a similar standard for those seeking U.S. citizenship? Think about that. When a U.S. citizen decides to leave the U.S. and renounce their citizenship, they often face taxes on income earned in the U.S. and on any gains from appreciated assets. That's not punitive. The answer, of course, is it's not punitive. My amendment would not punish any immigrant applicants. It would simply ensure that they pay no more and no less than U.S. citizens and resident aliens in the same economic position. In addition to claims that requiring the payment of back taxes is punitive, some have already claimed that it will be impossible to enforce because the applicants won't be able to determine what they owe in back taxes. This, too, is extremely misguided. The IRS is well experienced in estimating the tax liabilities for people who, for whatever reason, lack the records that normally support a tax return. They do it for U.S. citizens. Why can't we do it for people who now want to be on a path for citizenship but who haven't played by the rules? It just makes sense. Using bank records, credit card statements, housing records, and other evidence of an individual's lifestyle, the IRS is able to construct returns and estimate tax liabilities for non-filers who are U.S. citizens and resident aliens. The same process can be used for immigrants looking to qualify or certify, that they no longer owe any federal taxes. That's not a tough thing to do. It's something they do every day at the IRS. And it may very well be that a number of these people didn't make enough money to really pay any taxes anyway, but they should at least have to be honest about where they stand. And they should at least have to do what regular citizens in this country have to do. We're not asking any more or any less than that. In the end, the only way proponents of this bill can escape the label of amnesty is to ensure that immigrant applicants fulfill all their legal obligations and that they are not accorded any special treatment. We're talking about amnesty here. This is the way to get rid of amnesty and to pass this bill. And you simply cannot do that without requiring that they pay any taxes they still owe for income they earned during their U.S. residency. I think the authors of the bill know this because, once again, they've been claiming that the bill requires the payment of back taxes for months now. My amendment would simply fulfill the promise that they've already been making. Let's get it right. Let's not play games on this. What's more, if we put this amendment into effect, we would be reducing the tax gap. As you know, the tax gap is the difference between what is actually paid to the IRS and what taxpayers owe under the law. The most recent tax gap estimate we have is from 2006, when the tax gap was approximately $385 billion for a single year. A number of my colleagues talk a lot about closing the tax gap. On both sides of the floor, by the way. My amendment would take significant steps toward doing just that. Mr. President, as I said at the outset, none of my amendments are designed to punish immigrants who come forward out of the shadows. And none of them are designed to poison the well for immigration reform. My aim throughout this process has been to improve the bill. I believe we're engaged in an important effort here, but we have to do things the right way. And I made that effort during the markup of this bill. I didn't bring these 4 amendments up because they were Finance Committee amendments and probably would have been ruled out of order in the Judiciary Committee. And I agreed to defer with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle till the floor. Now I'm finding that all of a sudden there are roadblocks being put up on these very simple amendments. Too often over the past few years, the Senate majority has opted to ignore opportunities for bipartisan cooperation on issues of great importance. When the Senate first took up immigration reform, proponents of the bill said they were hoping to get at least 70 votes in the Senate. I said at the time that that was an important goal, that we needed to get at least that many votes to send the right message to the House of Representatives. However, this week there are indications from the Democratic leadership that they are willing to set these goals aside if they just get 60 votes. Well, guess where that's going to go with the House? We get 70 votes. It puts pressure on everybody involved in this matter, and I think we can get 70 votes. According to news reports out just today, 2 members of the majority leadership have indicated that they don't want to make too many concessions to conservatives in order to get Republicans on board. Instead, they just want to focus on getting 260 votes. Needless to say, I think that would be a serious mistake. I think there are a lot of people on this side who would like to vote for a final bill here. But they're going to need amendments like these that are basically simple amendments, non-punitive amendments that make sense, that basically show that we're not for amnesty. Immigration reform is too big to be done by just one party. And it can't be done with the support of just a small handful of Republicans. As courageous as those Republicans have been, as far as I'm concerned, it's going to take members of both parties to put together something that can not only pass, but also something that will work once it becomes law. We do have an opportunity to come together here on something that will make a real difference for a lot of people. Something that, if done correctly, can do a lot of good. I hope we don't waste this opportunity in favor of yet another political exercise. And once again, stated outright, I want to support this legislation, but I'm not going to if we don't do common sense things like this. And I'm laying down the gauntlet. I want immigration reform to succeed. These amendments will help it to succeed, not only here, but in the House of Representatives as well. But unless we address these 4 issues I've outlined today, and there are others, but these are the ones that I've decided to bend my plow over. Unless we address these 4 issues, I believe the bill is designed to fail. If not here in the Senate, then in the House of Representatives, and it would deserve to fail as far as I'm concerned. Most importantly, if we don't address these issues, the bill will not be able to be implemented in a fair and equitable way. And I think the American people would be justly outraged. Now, I know there are some who don't really care about these important issues. Now, I just urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support my amendments. I think it's critical that these amendments pass. Or work with me to find ways that I can please both sides. But I think they're pretty straightforward amendments. I was promised by leaders in the Gang of Eight that they would work with me, that they would help me to get these things done. I consider those promises to be very important. And yet I've had some indication over the last few days that maybe they're not going to work with me. I don't think anybody's acted in better good faith than I have. And as I've said, I'd like to support the bill. And make no mistake about it, I don't want people stiffing me on things that I consider to be important without even talking, without even working with me to resolve any problems they may have. And I'm not the kind of guy who takes that lightly. I think there's too much partisanship around here anyway. And frankly, if we could pass this bill with these amendments, I think it would go a long way to showing that not just 4 Republicans on our side who are courageous as far as I'm concerned, as I think the Democrat 4 are courageous in the Gang of Eight. But they're not the only ones who should support this bill if it's done right. Now, if this is going to be a political exercise, count me out. If this is an exercise to really try and resolve the amnesty issues, if it's an exercise to really try and resolve these critical issues, I can be counted in. Now, maybe I don't mean that much in this debate. But if you look at some of the major sections of this bill, I helped work them out. And I'll help work out this bill not only with colleagues on this side, but with colleagues on the other side of Capitol Hill. But I don't want to be stiffed at this time, and I'm not the kind of guy who takes stiffing lightly. And I see some real politics at work here rather than the kind of fair working together that we've got to have and that we got to start working towards if we want to really accomplish things that need to be accomplished during these next 3.5 years. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to join in this debate about immigration reform and to say, with regard to my colleague from Utah who just spoke, I think he makes a couple good points. One on the substance of the legislation and the need for us to be concerned about what the eligibility is, particularly as it relates to federal benefits to go to a legal status. But second, about the process. I do hope this process can be an open one. Not all of us are in the Gang of Eight. Not all of us are on the Judiciary Committee. A number of us have what we think are improvements to this legislation to make sure that it does work, and I hope there will be an openness to that over the next couple of weeks as we take up this legislation. It's my hope that working constructively in a bipartisan fashion, we can address some of what I see as shortcomings in this legislation. I do believe our current immigration system is broken. I think it's far too easy for people to cross our borders illegally and too easy for folks to find work without authorization. I think it's also too difficult for those who seek to come here in accordance with the law. So both the illegal and the illegal part of our immigration system needs fixing. It can't keep up with the demand for legal immigration or stem the tide of illegal immigration. So reform, I think, is essential. As it stands now, however, I am concerned that the legislation will not provide the country with a lasting, workable solution. Like a lot of my colleagues we just heard from today, Senator Cornyn talked about this, Senator Hatch talked about it, others have talked about it today on the floor. I remain concerned about a few things. One is the eligibility for federal benefits, Senator Hatch talked about. But for me, a lot of it comes down to meaningful enforcement of our laws, including on the border, very important, also entry-exit, as Senator McCain talked about, but significantly workplace enforcement. This is one area in particular I believe must be addressed in order for us to have a successful implementation of the bill. And particularly, I'd like to focus my comments today on what's called employment verification, or the E-Verify system. When we talk about strong enforcement measures, we hear a lot of talk about the border, and we heard a lot of discussion about it earlier today. And that's important. It's important to have a secure border for a lot of reasons, including the movement of guns and drugs and certainly terrorism, as well as immigration. But I tell you, I don't believe that border security alone will address the problem. Why? Because so many people enter here legally but then overstay their visas. It's estimated that 40% of those who are here illegally are here because they didn't cross a border but they overstayed their visas. So you're not going to solve that problem at the border. Second, I believe that no matter how many miles of fence we build or how many Border Patrol agents we put side by side along the border, as long as you have people wanting to come here for economic reasons, and I believe economic incentives are the primary reason people come to this great country, I think it's going to be very difficult to stop illegal immigration just at the border. I think we have to deal with the jobs magnet, which is why people are coming here. This, by the way, has been a discussion over the years, going back to the 1980s. The 1996 Act talked about the jobs magnet and the need for us to have an effective, at that point it was called the employer sanctions system. It was never put in place. That's one reason the 86 Act did not work. It's been in the debate for decades, and yet we haven't fixed it yet, and my belief is that the underlying bill still needs to be improved in this regard. Our current employer verification system has simply failed to address some of the very fundamental problems of having unauthorized workers. So effective employment verification to me is essential to the successful completion of this legislative process and to have a successful comprehensive immigration reform bill that prevents future illegal immigration. Simply put, whatever reform we may adopt in this Congress will fail in the long run, in my view, if we don't eliminate the enticement to come to our country to work. I believe we have a strong and workable E-Verify system. It can help solve this basic problem. Ideally, E-Verify would enable all employers to be able to first verify accurately and efficiently the identity of new employees, and second, to ensure their work eligibility. By ensuring that only authorized job seekers get hired, we can begin to remove that jobs magnet that, frankly, as I said earlier, undermined the 1986 reform effort, left us in a situation we face today, frankly, where we have over 10 million people working and living in the shadows here in this country. Ultimately, I believe that the E-Verify system contemplated by this legislation falls short, but can be improved. And while no verification system is perfect, the bill we are now considering mandates nationwide E-Verify implementation while doing little to address the fundamental flaws we've seen in E-Verify. There's a recent study that estimates that E-Verify has an error rate for unauthorized workers of 54%. That means half of the folks who are not authorized to work, who go through E-Verify, are able to be qualified anyway. In other words, the E-Verify system is not working to detect more than half of the unauthorized workers. In implementing a mandatory E-Verify system, we've got to do more to strengthen the protections against the fraudulent use of identifiers, particularly the Social Security card and Social Security numbers in the employment authorization process. And we need to improve individuals' data privacy protections in that process. The proposal before us attempts to address some of these problems through what's called a photo matching tool. This tool is designed to allow employers to compare a digital photograph from the E-Verify system with a photo on a new hire's passport, immigration document, or driver's license. Unfortunately, the verification system doesn't have access to photos for more than 60% of U.S. residents who do not have a U.S. passport or an immigration document, making the photo matching ineffective. The current legislation therefore relies on the states to give the Department of Homeland Security access to driver's license records on a voluntary basis. There is no assurance that all or even most states will choose to participate in this. Past experience with what's called the Real ID Act would indicate that fewer than half of the states will comply. Some say only 13 states have complied. Some say 18 states have complied. The fact is fewer than half of the states are complying with Real ID, which would mean on a voluntary basis it's unlikely we're going to get those driver's license, get those photos to be able to have photo match work effectively for the 60% of U.S. residents who don't have a passport or an immigration document. So I think more can be done to make this bill work better, and I'm committed to try to do that through legislation, amendments, and working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Mr. President, American citizenship is precious, and there are millions around the world who dream of attaining it. Our nation deserves an immigration system that works. We can get there, but only if we demand reform that recognizes the mistakes of the past, including the lack of promised enforcement from the 1986 law, and take steps to remedy those mistakes. I'm committed to addressing the deficiencies in the present legislation, and I'll work on the Senate floor to help strengthen border security, deal with the eligibility issue that Senator Hatch talked about, and eliminate this magnet of illegal employment. In particular, again, I'm committed to help ensure that E-Verify is implemented in a manner that does curtail the employment of unauthorized workers, protects privacy, and minimizes the burdens on employers, particularly small businesses. I sincerely hope we can get there, and I'm confident that if this process is indeed open, as was discussed earlier, if it's an open process where amendments are able to be accepted, where people of good faith on both sides of the aisle are trying to get to a solution for a broken immigration system, broken both in terms of legal immigration and illegal immigration, that we can in the end pass good legislation out of the United States Senate. Mr. President, I appreciate the time. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Sanders. Senator from Iowa is recognized.
Quorum be suspended.
Objection. So ordered.
I've come to the floor several times to discuss border security because border security is so essential to people approving the legislation that we pass, because most every poll shows that when people want an immigration bill, it's prefaced on the assumption that we're going to have a secured border.